In particular, the pasuk speaks about three things that the king is not allowed to do. One of them, I'm just going to switch over to a screen on those mitzvahs. Let's actually read it inside. Perak Yud Zayin Pasuk Yud Daled. I
don't know if it's just me, but your audio is in and out. Is everybody else?
No, he's fine with me.
It's fine with
able
me
to hear
too.
properly?
I'll stop shuckling. Maybe that will help. When you come to the land that Hashem is giving you, and
Robert, was the audio proper?
Yeah,
Up
the
until
audio
now?
is proper. Sorry, Rabbi. Yeah, it's fine, David.
So maybe it's on my end. Okay, sorry.
So when you come into the land that I'm giving you, you'll settle there. And you'll say, Asima alai melech. I want to place a king upon myself. Like all the nations around me. Soim tasim alecha melech. You shall place a king upon yourself. Asher yivcha Hashem lekecha boy. Hashem will choose that king. Mikerav achecha tasim alecha melech. It should be from amongst your brethren. You can't hire a foreign person to be your king. That's not your brother. It has to be a Jew and a born Jew. However, he should not have too many horses. So that he not bring the people back to Egypt to have too many horses. The Alshich explains that horses are a sign of arrogance. Too many horses, that is. And the king has to remain humble.
Rabbi, can you enlarge the text a little bit?
This text is a website. I'm not really sure how to enlarge it. Let me see if I press it that. Oh,
yeah, there you go.
That's better.
There it goes. Okay. So another point is that the horses of those days were a major component of battles. And if the king is going to have too many horses, the fear is that he's focusing on preparing for the battles physically and lessening the dependence and trust in Hashem that the Jewish people are supposed to have. And the pasuk says that he might bring the people back to Egypt to get horses. Egypt was the horse capital of the world in those days. Hashem Amar Lachem, and Hashem has told you, I do not want you to go back in that direction again. The next pasuk says, he should not have too many wives, so that they should not turn his heart astray. Basically, the idea of having too many wives is relating to indulging in too much physical pleasure. Another thing that is a problem for a king who has power and money and might use that to indulge, self-indulge. And that could take his heart away from Hashem, especially if he marries women who are not Jewish or perhaps converting for ulterior motives, political weddings, and so on. So their hearts might not be with Hashem, and they will turn him away from Hashem. And he should also not have too much gold and silver. So too much gold and silver obviously takes the focus of a person away from spiritual things and places it on physical things. And sometimes getting too much money can be associated with dishonest practices in getting that money. Instead of all that, what the king should have is a devotion to Torah, like it says in the next pasuk. When he sits on the chair of his throne, he should write a copy of this Torah, I'll say for on a book, in front of the Kohanim. It should be with him. We should read it for his entire life. So he'll learn the fear Hashem. To guard the Torah and keep it. Okay, so that's pretty much the mitzvahs of the king. How to make a king, what the king is not allowed to do, and what he's supposed to do.
Rabbi,
Yes.
will you discuss Shlomo HaMelech?
I'll touch upon him, yes.
Because of the horses and the wives?
Absolutely. Shlomo HaMelech unfortunately did not follow the mitzvahs in this chapter, and he followed the opinion of Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon says, "Darshinan timer dekra." We can base our observance of mitzvahs based on the reason for the mitzvahs. And he said, the whole reason for not marrying too many wives is because they might turn my heart astray. I, said Shlomo HaMelech, am not going to have my heart turned astray simply because I'm such a righteous man, such a wise man, which he was. But nevertheless, that was a little bit presumptuous on his part. And he ended up having, we know, 300 wives, 700 concubines. A lot of those women were not born Jewish. Their conversions were questionable. They continued their idolatrous practices. In particular, the daughter of Paro had a big impact on him. And he allowed for them to introduce idolatrous practices into the land of Israel. And he is faulted for that very much so by the Pasuk. He is not given a pass at all. In fact, the Torah records, the Sefer Melachim records that he worshipped idols at the end of his life. Although the Chachamim understood that he was permissive and allowed his wives to serve idols, but a tzaddik of his stature, to permit that behavior, it's as if he did it. So it's a very strong lesson of how we have to observe the mitzvahs and not try to interject our own interpretations to give ourselves leniencies and exceptions and so on. And another mitzvah that he did not follow is this one about not having too many horses. Shlomo HaMelech had so many horses that he bought the franchise, the horse, I don't know what it's called, but basically Egypt had the monopoly on horses in those days. So not only did he send people to trade in horses in Egypt, but he had such a big hand in that business that the king of Egypt sold that entire business to Shlomo's people. Shlomo's people became the middlemen for all the Egyptian horses, all of the selling and ordering of those horses. So he really took this to the extreme in terms of A, getting the horses, and B, really setting up a whole bunch of people living in Egypt to take care of that business. So unfortunately, despite his wisdom, he made mistakes.
So they got the monopoly on horses.
Exactly. They bought the monopoly on horses. That's correct. So let's focus a little bit on this pasuk, which is about not going back to Egypt. And first of all, what does the pasuk mean when it says, "V'Hashem Omar Lachem"? Hashem told you, "Lo seisifun lashu baderech hazeh," do not go back on this path ever again. Where did Hashem tell the Jewish people not to go back to Egypt?
When they left.
Some people say that he actually said it to them when they left. When is that? If you look back to the notes, it is, according to the Ibn Ezra, right before the Shir HaSayah, in Shmois, Perek Yud Gimel, Pasuk Yadalet. Vayomer Moshe Ela'am, Moshe said to the people, Al tiro, do not be afraid. Hisyatzu u'ruas Yeshuas Hashem, stand and see the salvation of Hashem. Asher Yasa Lechem Hayom is going to do for you today. Ki asher isam es Mitzrayim Hayom, like you're seeing Egypt today. Lo seisifu l'orisam oid ad olam. You'll never ever see them again. Now, the simple reading of this pasuk is that it's not a command, but it's a bracha. Hashem is saying to the Jewish people, you're worried about the Egyptians who are coming after you? Don't worry. You're going to have such a salvation, you'll never have to worry about them ever again. However, the Hamek Davar says that even though when you read the pasuk on its own, it seems like a bracha, not like a tzivui, not like a command. In light of this pasuk, where it says Hashem already commanded you not to go back, we're going to reinterpret that pasuk not just as a bracha, but also as a tzivui. And it's to be understood that Hashem is saying, you're seeing Egypt today, I don't want you to see them ever again. I don't want you to go back there and see them again. So that's the Ibn Ezra's pshat as explained by the Hamekdavar. The Hamekdavar was the Netziv, Reb Naftali Tzvi Berlin, the son-in-law of Reb Yitzchok of Volozhin, son of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, student of the Vilna Gaon, just to give you some of that background. Another pshat Ibn Ezra says is, when it says Hashem told you, it's an oral mitzvah that until now was not written, but Moshe had already communicated it to the Jewish people. And Moshe and Hashem was referring back to that oral mitzvah that he had already shared. And finally, the Torah on the Torah says, this is where Hashem is saying it. When it says Hashem has said to you, don't return back, this is it. Hashem is now telling you, don't do it. So don't have horses, because that might lead you to go back to Egypt. And what's wrong with going back? Hashem is telling you now, don't go back there. Okay, so now we have a question of the Rambam. The Rambam asks an obvious question on this pasuk, because it seems from this pasuk that if the king sends people back to Egypt to buy horses, that's a problem. In fact, halachically, it's not a problem. Because according to Chazal, when it says that you're not allowed to go back to Egypt, it's only talking about going for the purpose of living. According to Chazal, you are allowed to go back to Egypt if you want to see the pyramids, if you want to have a business meeting, you want to do some sightseeing, whatever it might be. It is permissible to go back to Egypt for pragmatia. Pragmatia means business. So what does the pasuk mean when it says that if the Jewish king has too many horses, he'll send people back to Egypt, and Hashem told you not to go back there? What's wrong with going back for the purpose of getting horses? So the way the Ramban interprets the pasuk, which is not the simple pshat, but that's what he says, is that it's two different concepts. First, there's a mitzvah not to have too many horses, because if you have too many horses, you may end up trusting in your army and not having proper faith in Hashem. And second of all, another problem is that you might end up going back to Mitzrayim in a manner that transgresses the mitzvah of not living in Mitzrayim, a totally separate Aveira. Because, like the Vilna Gaon says, Aveira gereres Aveira, one sin leads to the other. What's the connection between these two sins? Generally, when one Aveira leads to another, it's a logical progression. What is the progression here? Going back to Egypt based on having too many horses. So the Gur Aryeh says, the Gur Aryeh is the Maharal of Prague, and he says as follows, that actually before we get to the Gur Aryeh, I'll share with you another idea, that one of the reasons not to go back to Egypt is because it represents the reverse of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Yetzias Mitzrayim represents how Hashem took us out of the constraints of the Egyptians, made us into a special nation, and gave us our uniqueness as a people. Going back to Mitzrayim symbolically represents putting ourselves into that position of being subservient to another nation, reversing the effects of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And that's why some say that the entire Isser, the entire prohibition of going back to Mitzrayim, is only if you go back the same way you went in the first place. Like the pasuk says, "Lo toisifu lashuv baderech hazeh oid." You're not allowed to go back in the same path, which means if you go back from Israel through the Sinai desert into Egypt, that's a transgression. On the other hand, if you go from Israel to Babylonia, from there maybe to Spain, and then unfortunately the Jews were kicked out of Spain, many of them made their way back to Egypt, but they didn't come through the Sinai desert, so they're not reversing symbolically the exodus from Egypt, so that would not be a transgression. So based on this, we could possibly explain the connection. The Aveira of not trusting in Hashem leads to the attitude of going back to Egypt, which also represents going back to a place of not, fully trusting in Hashem like the Jews did. Okay. The Gur Aryeh says another interpretation. He says the reason you're allowed to go back for business is because when you go somewhere for business, you're not necessarily integrating into that society, because you're like a visitor. So the problem with going back to Egypt, as we're going to see, according to the other interpretations that we're going to see, is that you could get affected by the society, which was morally a very negative society. So if you don't mind to mute yourselves unless you have a question, that would be helpful.
There's somebody in the background who's not paying attention. Can you mute everybody for your master, for the host?
Yes. Okay, I've muted everybody, but you can unmute yourself at will.
Right,
So
thank
if you have
you.
any question, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
What Yehudim would go back to Mitzrayim unless they were Sadukim, not, they weren't from the Pharisees. I mean, it would be people who would go back to reestablish a kind of non-religious, approach to things. You know what I'm saying? I cannot see why. They go to the pyramids. They go into the pyramids. They see where the kings brought their gold and their silver, and they took everything with them. Why would that's what it seems to me. I can't understand it. It would probably be, there'd be a case for not going even on business, basically.
So, Egypt may not be the best place in the world, but if you're going on business, it's more of an in and out kind of thing. And hopefully it's not going to have that lasting impact that moving to a place and living there might have. So again, there's different reasons as to why not to live in Egypt. But in terms of learning from the people that are there, the impact of a person living there is obviously stronger than visiting there. But a lot of the people that did go back, by the way, were very religious people. They weren't only tzeddukim. There was a famous shul in Alexandria, which was so large that you couldn't hear the chazan. They had flags to show you when to say Amen and Baruch Hu and Kedusha, and they had different seating sections for different groups of professions and so on. So they did have a very built up frum community there. And in fact, they had a little Beis Hamikdash, by the way, that stood for 100 years. There was a Kohen Gadol who got into a fight with his brother and ran away from Eretz Yisrael. His name was Chanyoy, the son of Shimon HaTzadik. And he wanted to be a Kohen Gadol, but of course in Egypt, where he ran to, there was no Beis Hamikdash. He built a replica of the Beis Hamikdash in Egypt, and it stood for 100 years. People brought karbanos to Hashem in that Beis Hamikdash. We don't call it a Beis Hamikdash, we call it Beis Chanya, the house of Chanya. So they did have communities. Of course, we know the Rambam lived in Egypt. The Arizal was born in Egypt. The Radvaz, many great Torah sages lived in Egypt.
As a matter of fact, they just rebuilt some important Jewish synagogue in Egypt. The government rebuilt it.
I see. Right. And there's the famous Cairo Geniza that, is a collection of all the shemus that the people left there for hundreds of years, a very big source of learning for the Jewish community. So there were a lot of communities, and we have to understand how that was permissible. But in terms of this, what we're saying here, the Gur Aryeh says, is that if you're going back for business, you're not going to be so affected because you're not putting yourself under that framework. You're not a citizen. But if you're going back because you want horses, what that means is that you're subject to them. You need them. And once you're going that because you need them, that could affect you even if you're not a citizen. So that's how he understands the problem in this pasuk. Okay, let us talk about some reasons for this mitzvah. We already said that some say it has to do with the behavior of the natives. I'm up to number 5 if you're following in the notes. Some say it had to do with the behavior of the people in Egypt. Like the pasuk says in Parshas Acharimois, "Kemaisei eres Mitzrayim asher yishavtem ba lo yisasum." You should not behave like the Egyptians behaved. And Rashi says they would have homosexual relations, they would have adulterous relations. We know when we talk about the Makas B'chayros, there were all kinds of B'chayros dying who people did not know were B'chayros because they were B'chayros to their fathers who had adultery with married women. So there was a very immoral society going on there. And the Canaanim too, Kamase Eretz Canaan, the pasuk says there, you should also not follow the actions of the Canaanim. Now, in practice, Hashem told us to wipe out the Canaanim, and that's the way we took care of that problem, or we were supposed to at least. And in terms of the Egyptians, Hashem told us not to live there so that we not be affected by that society. We have another opinion, which we will explain more soon, but that opinion has to do with the land itself. Some say that the land of Egypt itself, regardless of the people that are living there, the land itself has a nature that causes the people to be immoral. Of course, we are not completely dictated by those sort of things, but nevertheless, it has an effect on us. And the Medrash talks about the Jewish people who were very careful in terms of their relationships, that they stayed apart from the nations that surrounded them for centuries, first in Israel, then in Egypt, then in the desert. And it was only when they came to a place called Shittim that they started to sin with the daughters of Moab. And the Medrash attributes this change in their behavior to the water of Shittim. The water of Shittim somehow, for some reason, affected them so that it led them more towards that immoral behavior. Again, it didn't force them to do it. They're still punished for their behavior. We're not excusing it, but it gave them more of a tendency towards it. And Mitzrayim had a similar kind of problem, that the land itself could bring about a tendency towards immoral behavior. And the Rambam says, I'm going to quote it later on, but the Rambam says that if a Jewish king conquers the land of Mitzrayim in a manner that turns the land into Eretz Yisrael, well, at that point, it's permissible to live there. Because at that point, it no longer has the characteristics spiritually of the land of Egypt, and it actually becomes holy like the land of Israel. So, and then we have the concept of not appreciating the Exodus, which is the Riva. Sorry, that's the Rabbeinu Bachaya. We're going to see it in a minute. And that has to do with what we said before, that if you go back the same way you came, that shows on a lack of appreciation for Hashem taking us out. Okay, point number 6 in the notes. Like we mentioned before, many Jewish communities lived in Egypt, Orthodox, frum communities. There was a group that left Eretz Yisrael to go to Egypt after the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. We know that the small group that was led by Gedaliah, where Yirmiyahu also stayed, was attacked by a fellow named Yishmael, who killed Gedaliah and many other members of that group. And that group ended up going back to Egypt. And Yirmiyahu warned them not to go back. And he said, if you go back, the sword that you're trying to escape from will follow you there. And in the end, they were massacred in Egypt. And unfortunately, some of the other communities who did live in Egypt ended up also in a bad way. In fact, the Beis Chonyoy that I mentioned earlier, that house which was functioning as some kind of Beis Hamikdash, the Romans, after destroying the Beis Hamikdash, were afraid, the real Beis Hamikdash, were afraid that that house would also turn into a point of worship for the Jewish people and might become a center for the next rebellion. They destroyed the house and destroyed much of the community. So there were many massacres of Jews in Egypt, and there is, the Gemara does draw some kind of connection between the fact that it's forbidden to live in Egypt and how many Jews who did live in Egypt were actually killed. But nevertheless, we find, even after that Gemara was written, many righteous Torah scholars and communities lived in Egypt. Like we mentioned before, all those names of holy people. So different explanations for why this was okay, or at least not so terrible. Rabbeinu Bachaya, who is not to be confused with the author of the Chovas Halvavos. Rabbeinu Bachaya, who wrote the Chovas Halvavos, is Bachya ibn Pikuda. Rabbeinu Bachaya, who wrote a interpretation on the Chumash, an explanation on the Chumash, is Bachya ben Asher. He lived a few hundred years later, both from Spain. But anyway, he suggests that this mitzvah is actually not one of the 613 mitzvahs. It was only a temporary mitzvah that lasted for that generation. That generation was particularly wicked, and it was only in that generation they were forbidden to go back, not in subsequent generations. That's a very big chiddush. Another interpretation he gives is, like we said before, it's only forbidden to go back from Eretz Yisrael, like the pasuk says, "Baderech hazeh," on this path. The Ritva adds, and this makes it nearly impossible to transgress on this sin. The Ritva adds that it's only forbidden if you go back following the exact camping places that the Jews camped in on their way out. We know they camped in 42 stops. To transgress, you have to stop at every one of those 42 stops in order. And then you went back Baderech hazeh, on this path, and that's the problem. So otherwise it's not forbidden, and that would mean that it's nearly impossible to transgress in this way because we don't even know exactly where those 42 stops are. Now, the Riva, another interpretation on the Chumash, says that the original Egyptians are completely gone. The whole problem, like we said before from the tour, is that it's the behavior of the Egyptians was immoral, and you're going to be affected by that behavior. Well, that was then. But the original Egyptians are all gone. No one is left. We know there was a fellow named Sancherib, an Assyrian king. The Gemara says, Ba Sancherib uvilbel as kol ha'umos. Sancherib came along and he mixed up the entire world. Any nation he conquered, which at that time was the whole civilized world, he didn't want them to rebel. The way he prevented that, in his mind, of course, couldn't really prevent it, but the way he tried to prevent it was by moving the population around, population transfer. And that way he figured they would not start up with him because they would not be comfortable in their new land. And which is why, by the way, as we're going to see soon, there is no prohibition to marry a Egyptian convert. The Torah says you have to wait 3 generations to marry an Egyptian convert. Now you don't have to, because they're not the same Egyptians. You're not allowed to marry a male Ammoni and Moavi convert at all. Nevertheless, you are allowed to marry a Jordanian or Saudi Arabian, Syrian convert. I'm not sure exactly where the borders of Moab and Ammon were exactly, but it's in that area. You're allowed to marry a convert from those countries today because it's a different population. So in terms of living there, the Riva says the same is true. You're not going to be affected by them because it's a different population group. Now, the Rambam seems to disagree with all of these opinions, except for the Radvaz, which I didn't explain yet. So I'll get back to the Radvaz in a minute. The Rambam says, I'm up to number 6e in the notes. The Radvaz says, Umuter lishkoin b'chol ha'olam chutz me'eretz Mitzrayim. You're allowed to live everywhere in the world besides Egypt. That's the only place you're not allowed to live. Menayam Agadol, Vada Ma'ariv, Arba Me'ez Parsa, Arba Me'ez Parsa. He gives you the borders from the Mediterranean and from, I guess he means the Red Sea, 400 parsa to the west, up until the land of Ethiopia and the desert. Hakol also lisyasha, but you can't live anywhere there. And then he says, we're told 3 times in the Torah not to live in Mitzrayim. That's what we just had. Another pasuk in Parshas Kisaveh coming up in a few weeks. You shouldn't see it again. And finally, the one we quoted earlier from Parshas B'Shalach, you'll never see it again. Now, this Rambam does not give you any wiggle room. He doesn't say about going back through Sinai Desert. He doesn't say that it doesn't apply today. Nothing. So he apparently does not hold of those leniencies. The Radvaz, who is a commentary on the Rambam, says that the reason that the communities lived there is because they originally did not come for the purpose of settling there. They moved there for business, and then they ended up staying. So it was a lav she'ein boi maisa, meaning to say when they moved, they didn't transgress because they didn't plan to live. They just planned to do business. And when they stayed, they didn't do an action of a sin. They just didn't leave. So it's not as severe of a sin. And because it was a difficult thing to leave, and it was other countries had a lot of anti-Semitism and so on, so they ended up staying. So it's kind of a somewhat of an explanation for that behavior. Okay, let's stop and take questions before we continue. Does anybody have any questions?
So how did Rambam justify his residency in Mitzrayim?
How did the Rambam justify himself living in Egypt?
Yes.
So, to the best of my knowledge, he did not address it directly, although it is said that he would sign his letters, or at least some of his letters, that he transgressed 3 prohibitions every day. So he kind of, did not make an excuse for himself, and he said that kind of, I'm not really doing the right thing. But the Radvaz has the best explanation that I'm aware of, which is that the Rambam did not move to Egypt because he was planning to stay there. If we look at the Rambam's life, he started off in Spain. He had to run away because of the crazy Muslims, where they had that problem then too, the Almohads they were called, that group. So he moved to Morocco, and again that group was making problems there as well, extremists trying to kill the Jews. So he moved to Eretz Yisrael actually, and he was in Eretz Yisrael for a year, but unfortunately the land was so desolate, so sparsely populated, it was simply not a safe place to live. So he went to Egypt just because he needed somewhere to be safe. He went there more as a haven than as a place to live. But once he was there already, he became very heavily involved in the community. He became a doctor for the Sultan, as we know, and he helped the Jewish community in so many ways. So he kind of ended up staying without really moving with the intention to live. So like the Radvan says, he would never have moved there with the intention to live, but once he was already there, and to leave would mean, so to speak, abandoning the community and the people that he was working with, when the sin of staying is not as great as moving, because you're not actively sinning, you're just not leaving. So it's like a passive sin. So that's the way the Radvaz explains it. Sure.
Can I ask you, from what I understood at the beginning of our class,
Yep.
all of these rules were designed for kings. Are we talking now about just a general population of Israelis, or it's only the rules that were designed for the kings?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. So the way to understand the pasuk is that Hashem does not want the king to have too many horses. That's for kings only. And the reason is because he might send people back to Egypt. And this is what applies to everybody. And I have already told you meaning to say the Jewish people, I don't want you going back to Egypt. So the thing about horses is for the king, but the thing about not living in Egypt is for everybody.
And for how long, knowing the history, actually this prohibition or this rule actually was in existence? If we know that King Solomon already kind of broke this command, it's not the commandments, but the law or the rules, how long was it actually in practice? And what is the modern way of, applying this rule to our lifestyle?
Right. So it depends on the opinions that we've mentioned. Some say it was a prohibition only for that generation. Some say it applied all the way until the time of the Assyrians, who moved all the populations around, and at that time it became permissible. Excuse me. And some say it still does apply today. So in terms of a person who wants to be strict, they will not purposefully get up and move to Egypt. You might go there to visit, you might go there to sightsee, but you will not say, I am immigrating to Egypt. I don't know if they would accept Jews anyway now, not to emigrate there, but it's preferable not to actually move there. The fact that King Solomon did it is not really a proof, because as we know, he made mistakes, and the pasuk does fault him for his mistakes. We don't, in our religion, we don't give a pass to even the biggest tzaddikim. If they do something that Hashem considers wrong, obviously we're not the ones to judge, but if they do something that Hashem and the prophets of those times considered wrong, it's recorded that it's wrong. So Shlomo HaMelech made mistakes, unfortunately.
Okay. And do we know of any really holy people who became actually children of the marriage as, King Solomon and non-Jewish wife?
Well, let's put it this way. Since King Solomon was a righteous Jew and generally a holy Jew, even though he made mistakes, we certainly believe that he converted the women that he married. Perhaps the conversion wasn't so sincere, like we see that a lot of them went back to their idolatrous ways, but there was a conversion. And yes, absolutely, the next king, the king after him, who was the father and grandfather and ancestor of all the subsequent Jewish kings in the line of King David, obviously, she was an Ammonite convert.
Yeah, the Rusi, I know that. Okay. Okay, interesting. And when you mentioned that he allowed to worship idols, is it just because he allowed or because he was personally involved in that action?
Well, the text makes it sound as if he was personally involved, but the way our sages interpreted it is that he never would have done it himself, but he did not want to fight with his wives, and he was permissive in that area.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for making it clear.
Sure. Okay, so here is where we have the question that the Lubavitcher Rebbe asks, and this is in number 7. The Rambam writes, I only put in the Hebrew here, but I'll translate it. When Sancheir came up, he mixed up the whole world, and he exiled them. The people in Egypt are no longer the same people. The same is true of the Edomites. Now that those 4 nations have been exiled, meaning to say there are 4 nations that we have prohibitions against marrying. The Ammonites, the Moabites, we may never marry a male convert, even after many generations. And the Egyptians and the Edomites, we can marry after 2 generations. But now all those restrictions are gone because all those nations are mixed up. Any one of them that separates himself to convert, presumably separated from the majority of those people. And the majority are not the original nations. Therefore, when a convert will convert nowadays, wherever, Bein Edomi, Bein Mitzri, Bein Ammoni, Bein Mayavi, Bein Cushi, whether he's a Dumian, Egyptian, Ammonite, Moabite, or Ethiopian, Bein Shara Omos, or other nations, male or female, Mutar and Levi B'Kol Meyad, they can marry into the Jewish people immediately. So here's a contradiction. On the one hand, we say that according to the Rambam, you still cannot live in Egypt. And on the other hand, we say that they're not the same Egyptians. Well, if they're not the same Egyptians, then why are they any worse than any other country? It's just a new nation. They were taken from who knows where. For all we know, they're Indians. So why does the rule against not living in Egypt apply? Now, if you say that it's the land itself, then we can explain it. We were saying before that maybe it's the land. The land itself causes the people to misbehave. Like the Rambam says, and I quoted the Hebrew number 8, if it's conquered by a Jewish king, it changes. But as long as it's not conquered, the land itself can have that quality that leads people to sin. And like the Medrash says, quoted in number 9, that the Jewish people were affected negatively by the place called Shittim. And similarly, the Jewish people can be affected by living in the physical land of Egypt. So that would explain the contradiction. On the one hand, we are allowed to marry them because they're different people. On the other hand, we can't live there because the land itself somehow lends itself to immorality. The problem with that is that the Rambam himself wrote another book called the Sefer HaMitzvahs. The Rambam has 4 famous books. The Rambam has the Yad HaChazaka, which is his compendium of halacha. The Rambam has Pirush HaMishnah, his commentary on the Mishnah. He has the Sefer HaMitzvahs, which he lists all the mitzvahs and explains them. And he has the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed. In the Sefer HaMitzvahs, he explains that the reason why not to live in Egypt is because of the people. Here it is in the Hebrew. She'eziranu mishkoim be'eretz Mitzrayim la'olam. We've been warned not to live in Egypt forever, kadesha le'nilman mima'aseyem, so that we not learn from their behavior. The le'nelech b'darchem hamagunim, and not go in their negative behaviors. And that's why it says, don't return in that path ever again. Meaning to say, living there will make you return in the path, in the behaviors that they had. Okay, so I'm going to ditch the notes now for the rest of the class because we don't have time to go through them inside, but I'm just going to explain to you the explanation that the Rebbe gives outside, and feel free to look at the notes at your leisure. So here's the explanation. There are some Egyptians left in Egypt. When Sancheirav did the population transfer, he was not able to completely move all the Egyptians out. He got most of them, but not a majority of them. Excuse me. He got a majority of them, but a minority were left behind. So when it comes to marrying an Egyptian, we say the person who's coming to convert is separating himself from the Egyptian society. How are they separating themselves? By the very fact that they're coming to convert. So they're leaving behind that society, coming to a new society, a new group. We say, here's the Chazal's way of expressing it. Our sages expressed it, and they said, Kol de parish, meruba parish. When you leave, you're leaving from the majority. So we're going to assume that convert is from the majority of the population, which is now not native Egyptians, which is why there is no limitation on marrying them for the first 2 generations. On the other hand, in terms of living in Egypt, we have to consider that there is still a minority that lives there. And here's a concept in halacha, which is kol kavua. Anything that is in its original place is kemechza al mechza, is treated like half and half. It's never treated like it's insignificant. When something is in its place, it's considered significant, even if it's a minority. And in note 11, you'll see a link where you can read more about that. But the point is that in terms of being affected by the people, we have to remember that there is a minority of Egyptians even today that are descendants of the original Egyptians. And those people are considered to have bad moral values, and they can affect the majority of the population that does live there in a negative way. And they can also affect a Jew who moves there in a negative way. So that's why the law against living there still applies, but the law of marrying a convert from there does not apply, because the convert is separating himself from that society, and the native person, and when it comes to living there, on the other hand, we say that that they could still affect you because they're living in their place. So that's a pretty much overview of the Sicha. I didn't cover every single point, but those are the major points. Please feel free to ask any questions if you have any.
Regarding marrying not marrying Moabites, that only applies to men. A Moabite woman, Ruth, for example, she was able to marry a Jew. Exactly.
That was actually a subject of great controversy, and there were those who held that it was forbidden. But in the end, that was the position accepted by our sages, And that's why King David was considered a legitimate member of the Jewish society, accepted as the king and his descendants and so on and so forth. But that was originally a bit of a question, but in the end it was resolved favorably, that it only applies to the males and not the females.
Does that apply to the other communities that were Isser for marriage, or just?
So it's a good question. To the best of my knowledge, it applied to the Moabites and the Ammonites. I believe for the Egyptians and the Edomians, where it was only a two-generation thing, I believe that was male and female. If I'm not mistaken, that applied to both male and female. But the one that is forever, the Ammonites and the Moabites, that was just for the males.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. All right. So I guess I'll exit the meeting if that's okay.
So what's the main takeaway?
The main takeaway is that we are very affected by the place that we live. And we have to choose that place very carefully. Even if we think that we are holy and righteous and beyond being affected, the Torah sees that we are affected by our society, and we have to choose good neighbors and a good country and a place that's going to affect us positively. So that's point number one. Another point the Rebbe makes actually is about how this mitzvah shows us the eternity of the Torah. You know, some mitzvahs are like in the history books. We know there was a Beis Hamikdash, there were sacrifices, and we learn about all those laws, but it's not like practical in terms of our actions today. This mitzvah, based on this explanation, we understand that it's actually the same Egyptians, some of them today, that were living in Egypt, descendants of the same Egyptians from 3,000, however many years ago. So it's just a kind of mitzvah that we really see the continuity of the Torah till today.
Rabbi Citron,
Yes.
question for you.
Yes.
Can't we say that the Egyptians that live now are not the same because of the force of Islam on the Egyptians?
So there is definitely a change of religion from then till now. Then they were pagan, and now most of them are monotheistic, because of the Islamic movement, 100%. But it seems like this immoral behavior was not about being pagans per se, because the whole society at that time was pagan, but it seems more of their behavior between men, women, marriage kind of attitudes and those kinds of things. And that is not necessarily changed by the change of religion. Even if the religion says that they're not allowed to do certain behaviors, but if they tend towards those behaviors, that perhaps is something deeper than just the religion that they're officially part of.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I have a question. When Morsi was in power, the cops were in conflict, obviously, with them, and they were fighting for the pyramids, that they shouldn't be defaced and so forth. This is not, even though they're Christians, they are, they still were fighting for the protection of the monuments that they have there that, many of the tourists were coming to see there, Yep. And my concern is that this could reestablish Egypt as a way, because it will actually reinforce what they had before by something like this coming about. Now, as it is, obviously Morsi didn't succeed, but these kinds of things may not stop in the past. It could be a recurrence again. You know what I'm saying?
Well, what can I say?
The cops are the ones who
Right.
many of the cops who do believe that they are the direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians, Many
Right.
of them will come forth and say that,
Maybe
And,
they are. I have no idea.
So who would you say would be more correct in terms of dealing with the monuments, defacing these pyramids or
We don't have
allowing
to-
them
we
to
don't-
be?
We believe in defacing idol worship and idol worshiping places, but we don't have to deface other archaeological sites. There's no reason for that.
I think that he was trying, or they were trying to make sure that another Taliban episode that happened in their country not to happen in Egypt, because of the fact that these are, historical sites.
Right.
That was the whole point. It's not as if you're doing any kind of idol worship of the pyramids.
Right.
So I think that they were trying very hard to make sure that didn't happen.
Right. I hear